Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. You're watching In Deep on the Delta, and today we're going to be talking about establishing bass fishing patterns. And for those of you who are new to bass fishing, or maybe been in the game for a while and you're honing your skills, wanting to get into some tournament fishing and work your way up the ladder to bass fishing stardom, I'm going to just throw this out there right off the bat. When it comes to putting more fish in the boat, being able to establish patterns, how quickly you can establish patterns is probably one of the keys to becoming a better bass angler. It's fun to collect baits and get fancier rods and reels and maybe a faster bass boat and do all that stuff. That's part of bass fishing, but that's not what's going to take you to the next level. When it comes to talking about patterns, there is no one there's no set of parameters that say this is a bass fishing pattern. So everyone you talk to out here has a different view of what a pattern is. So you can go out on any given day and talk to a couple different people at the dock, and they may have caught the exact number of fish in the exact time frame. And one guy's going to tell you he had a really slow day. One guy's going to tell you that I went out, I found a pattern, I caught some fish. Well, it could be a 10-hour day that they both caught 4 fish. The guy that had the pattern said he had a pattern because 3 of the 4 fish he caught were all on the same boat. So that's what you have to deal with when you're dealing with the dock talk. Take it with a grain of salt. I guess my first suggestion would be, don't let anglers tell you what the pattern is. Let the fish tell you what the pattern's going to be. And again, you guys know this, there's not going to be anybody standing at the end of the dock passing out pamphlets telling you what the daily pattern is. You're not going to get in your boat and head out of the marina and find a big billboard somewhere that says this is the daily pattern. It doesn't happen. You got to figure it out on your own. You got to be able to do it quickly, and again, it is not an exact science. Some of the things I'll talk about today, like when we're talking about don't pay a whole lot of attention to dock talk, it can really play with your psyche when you are listening to people all the time saying that they're catching fish or they have a pattern going and everything's going swell for them, and it's not going so swell for you. So just keep that in mind and don't let dock talk get you down. Now today we're going to talk about what is a pattern. We're going to talk about some of the key ingredients that you're going to need to have in your arsenal when it comes to actually getting out on the water and looking to establish a pattern. And then once we talk about that, I'm going to run around the Delta and I'm going to hit a few normal spots out here. We're going to look at some tule banks, some rock banks, maybe some points, some different things, and we'll talk about how to put the information that we go over into practical use, so that when you go out you can start saying, you know what, I think too many videos people talk about how to do things, and when you get on the water yourself it just doesn't translate into practical use. So by the time we do the entire video, hopefully something that you may not quite understand that I say at the beginning of the video will come into focus as we actually go out and talk about some of the things that we're explaining. So with that, what is a pattern? And I can say that I think I heard Mike Iaconelli at one time say his definition of a pattern was 1 fish, no big deal, means nothing. 2 fish, that could be a coincidence. 3 fish, that's a pattern. Well, that's a very simple way to put it. But for me, if those 3 fish came in a 10-hour day, that's a pretty loose pattern. If those 3 fish came in a 30-minute period and they were all on the same bait at the same depth, and you were using the same lure retrieve in the same types of areas, that's a little more of a pattern. So again, be aware of what other people think a pattern is. With that being said, when I come out to maybe a new body of water, or maybe it's here on the Delta and I haven't been on the water for a while, or maybe it's an unfamiliar body of water, but when I come out, the first thing that I like to do is fish pretty quickly. I like to cover water. I do that because obviously I don't have a pattern when I get on the water. I'm not starting out with a pattern. I've got to figure something out. So I like to cover different types of water with different baits as quickly as I can, at least the first couple hours of the day, hoping to get a few bites and then slowing down and honing the pattern that I'm working on. So we'll start off by talking about, let's just say I'll give you about 10 things that you want to be thinking about every day when you are on the water. And the first thing, the first 3 or 4 of them we're going to talk about are more weather and seasonal type things. And obviously you want to be thinking about seasonal patterns. You want to think about day-to-day patterns. And when you go out on any given day, you're going to want to think, am I going to fish a change of light in the morning or in the evening? Am I going, if you're on the delta, am I going to be fishing a change of tide? Is it going to be a windy day today? Is it going to be cloudy? Is there going to be levels of low light period and sunlight? Things like that are going to be, the weather fluctuations throughout the day are going to be something that you might want to consider. And again, if you are on the delta, tide is always a key. The other thing that a lot of people don't think about is moon phases. Even though you're fishing throughout the day, there will be a couple of lunar periods, and it could be when the moon's coming up, when the moon is dropping. Keep that into consideration. Moon phases are very important during the daylight hours, and when you look at whatever your information is, tide charts or weather charts, you're always going to see a moon phase. And during that moon phase, it's always going to be a period of when fish and game are a little more active. So take that into consideration. And last but not least, water temperature. And that might go with seasonal patterns, but the water temperature is going to a lot of times dictate, how quickly or how much the fish are moving, how active they are. And a general rule is, the lower water temperatures in the 40s and 50s, bass tend to be a little lethargic. They don't eat as much, they move slower. You may have to fish slower moving baits. As the water temperatures warm up into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they're generally a little more active, and you can get away with fishing a little faster. So those are weather related, seasonal related, daily related things that you're going to want to think about. And the first thing that I look at when I'm talking about bait selection is depth. What depth will a bait cover? I'm also looking at what speed I can of retrieve I can use on that particular bait. I'm looking at the type of water that bait will cover. And then last but not least, I'm thinking about size and color. And let me go over this a little bit. When I am picking out my baits, and let's just say I'm looking at the body of water that I'm going to fish, and maybe it's all rock or it's all, mud bank or whatever, or maybe there's a lot of slop like on the delta. I'm going to want to have baits that I can cover slop with. Something where I have mats and a lot of weeds. I want something that's going to be weedless. I'm going to want some topwater baits, and I'm going to want baits that cover topwater not only very quickly, like a buzz bait or a whopper plopper, but I'm going to want maybe a couple of poppers in my arsenal that I can cover the top very slowly. So I'm giving those fish multiple choices when it comes to topwater fishing. As we go down in the water column, I'm going to want to have maybe some crankbaits, some chatterbaits, maybe a jerkbait, depending on what time of year it is. And I want to be able to cover that midsection of water. And again, I want to have baits that I can fish maybe very slowly and erratically, like a jerkbait. And then I'll have crankbaits and maybe paddle tail swim baits or something that I can really burn through the water. And then maybe a bait like a chatterbait where I can speed up, slow down, do whatever it takes to get those fish to bite. So I've got topwater baits, I've got baits that are going to cover the mid section of water, and then I'm going to want some bottom bouncing baits, which generally are going to be worm style baits, creature baits, Carolina rigs, T-rigs, things of that nature, maybe wacky rigs, things that I can move slowly along the bottom to pick up those fish. So we start off in the morning, we kind of take in our seasonal and daily patterns. We have a bait selection that's going to cover from top to bottom, slow to fast, and once we dial in on that bite, then we can dial in a little closer on the baits when it comes to size and color. When we get out on the water, we keep an open mind. I want to fish fast, I want to cover water, and I also want to cover the type of water that has multiple holding spots. So here on the Delta, if we have a rock bank and it's just a half a mile of rock bank, that could hold fish, but I'm looking for a rock bank that may have some tules, some sparse tule clumps from time to time. That's even better. If that same rock bank has rock and tules, and maybe there's a real defined depression in between some of the submerged vegetation and the bank, if it has that trough in there, that's even better. If the vegetation is nice and clean and there's an outside edge, even better. So now that bank that when we first look at it was just a rock bank, it turns into a bank that has several things on it that make me want to fish it. Now if that bank has some inlets and some points on it, even better. These are not necessarily places that I fish all the time that are great places. They're just places that I am giving you general information that you need to take and digest and put it into your own portfolio and use it to your advantage. And I'm trying to go about this video kind of in the vein that if I give you a fish, you're going to eat fish for that afternoon. If I can give you this information that hopefully helps you to catch fish, you're going to catch fish for the rest of your life. So with that piece of philosophy, let's pull up and I'm going to go down to the end of the bank. We're going to start talking about some specific ideas that you can use when you're out here. Okay, we pulled up on a spot here, and when I pulled up, there was a bunch of swallows swarming around, and as soon as I got the camera ready and everything, they're gone. But I want to talk first about bird activity out here. You know, I've spent a lot of time fishing the ocean. When we're fishing saltwater, birds are so important, but it seems the farther you move inland, the less people think about bird activity. And you know, here on the Delta, the striper guys, they're really aware of the birds, especially the diving birds, the seagulls that are swarming around, you know, honing in on those balls of bait, which obviously are attracting the stripers. But when it comes to largemouth bass fishermen, they don't think a whole lot about the bird activity. And one thing that I'll talk about is the swallows, the small birds that you see generally in the morning and the evening swarming around, and they're eating bugs. Well, that's an important sign, because throughout the day you will also see the bird activity increase and decrease. And what that's telling you is they are honing in on the start of the food chain. When the swallows are active, they're eating insects that are flying around. Well, think about this. The insects that are flying above the water, they hatch from the water. They start as a nymph, they emerge from the water, they become adults, and then they become airborne, and the bird activity starts. Well, if you've got a lot of bird activity and there's a lot of emerging activity, that's going to tell you that there's a lot of bugs that are active in the water. When those bugs, the small macroinvertebrate, are moving around, that's a key that should be telling you the bait fish, the crayfish, the bluegill, the sunfish, they're going to be active too. So keep an eye on the birds. When you see the birds moving around, know that there's a lot of bug activity, and that is the start of a food chain. Think about the bluegill that are going to be moving around, and the crayfish that are also eating and becoming vulnerable to the largemouth bass. Let's talk about this place that we're at, because it has several things that I'd like to talk about. Again, when we're out here, first couple hours, we're moving around quite a bit, and we're looking for key spots to start on. We want to find spots that have multiple holding spots for fish. So instead of just fishing a rock bank, we'll want to fish a rock with tules and vegetation. When we're fishing these little sloughs in here, in this particular slough, we have lots of surface vegetation, there's submerged vegetation, there's a dock behind us, there's man-made structure, and there's a bunch of trees and vegetation on the bank that's going to, again, hold everything from birds to When it gets in the riparian zone here, frogs, lots of bugs, lots of insects, and that's the start of a food chain. I also want to talk about this little patch of floating vegetation that we have here. And this is another thing that I look for. Instead of going to an area like might be over here, where it's just this huge floating mat of hyacinth and you have to really pick that apart, I would rather go to smaller places like this and be able to fish them very quickly. Throw a half a dozen punch casts in here. Maybe as I'm pulling up, I'll throw a frog or a topwater, and then see if I can get bit, and then I will start honing in on that pattern. I also like to fish vegetation that has more than one type of specific vegetation in it. So I'm going to move the camera up here and I'm going to point out something that you may not be aware of just looking at this particular piece of vegetation here. Okay, nice little mat here. It's small, it's punchable, and it has 3 different families of floating vegetation. Right in here, this stuff in here, this is duckweed. That's one type of vegetation. This stuff with the leaves here, some of you may notice that that is primrose, and then in the back we have hyacinth. We have some hyacinth over here. So I don't know what it is, but when I find mats like this that have several types of vegetation all condensed into one little area, I tend to catch more fish out of mats like this. Before we leave this area, we've talked about all the different types of structure we have that may hold a fish. Let's get back to when I started talking about baits, the baits that I want to have on the deck to cover a number of situations. So if I come into this little area here and I'm only maybe fishing 100 feet of bank because it has so much structure, I'm going to want to pull up and maybe fish with a frog, or obviously when I see water like this that is slop, I'm going to want to have a frog on, and I'm going to want to have a punch set up on. I'm also going to want to have maybe a crankbait that I can run through here, depending on the depth and how much submerged weed growth. That crankbait, if it's not going to run through the submerged weeds, I may want to have a chatterbait. I want to have a topwater, maybe a buzzbait or something that I can come in here and just run down this bank and really fish it fast, hoping to get a bite or two. But what I'm getting at is when we pull up to a spot like this, we want to make sure that on our deck are a number of different baits that we can fish in the slop, in the open water, through the weed vegetation, some baits that we can slow down, some baits that we can burn in here. We'll spend about 10-15 minutes in here. I don't want to spend 45 minutes in a little area like this because unless I'm getting bites, because we're going to try to establish a pattern. If we get a couple of bites in here, we'll look for similar areas like this and then start moving around and find honing in on that pattern. Okay, we're not more than about 100 yards from that first spot we just went over, and what we've done is we went from one side of an island to the other side, and this is a whole different scenario here. Another situation that is really a perfect place to start when you're looking to establish a pattern. Now we've got some tules here, we've still got some surface vegetation, we've got some offshore tules, we've got a lot of these willows that hold a lot of birds in it, a lot of bugs. But now, if you can focus in, the sun is behind these trees. So on the bank that we just talked about, it was a sunny bank. On this side of the bank, it's totally shaded. So this is something that on any given day, looking at these two spots, maybe one will produce, the other one won't. But it's a good thing to always keep in mind where shady banks are, especially when you have trees, or I don't care if it's man-made structure, whatever, that's throwing shade on the water. Be aware that even though you're 100 yards from a spot that you may have fished pretty thoroughly and didn't get a bite, you don't have to go far to possibly find a honey hole. So be aware on this particular bank, we have tules, we have submerged vegetation, we have floating vegetation, we have a shade line. And if we look over here, We've got some docks, some submerged, some old houseboats. So there's lots of things in here that we can come in here and cover very quickly again and just see if we can pick up a few bites. So another thing that I'd like to throw out here, when you're fishing these areas and maybe you don't catch a fish, you fish 3 or 4 of them, you think, man, these are really good looking spots, they're not panning out. Think about putting them in your log or in the back of your mind and coming back at a different tide on the a different time. On the Delta, it could be a different tide. It could be 2 weeks later. It could be coming back in the winter, coming back in the fall. Just keep logging all of these places that you're fishing, even if they're not panning out on that particular day. Don't think that it's lost time because you didn't catch any fish here. Think of it as, I've gained some knowledge and I am I know what this place is, and I'm going to come back and fish it and maybe catch some fish at a later date. But I want to point out a very subtle thing that you need to be watching for when you're out here on the Delta. Now, we're here in Disappointment Slough. We're about a quarter mile off of the channel, and I'm not saying this is the spot that you want to fish, but if you look out this way, we've got Disappointment Slough coming in here, and we've got a pretty good flow coming in off of the channel. The other thing, as we turn around here, we have a cut between the Thule Islands. And I don't know if you could see it, but it's an incoming tide, and that cut is adding to the flow of water that's coming in through here. So what's happening, get out here so I can explain that. We have a current flow coming down the main part of Disappointment Slough. We have a break in the islands which is funneling water through and increasing the current. So possibly on a bank like this, out of the 400 or 500 yards that you can see down there, as this current comes in and hits the bank right here, this is going to be the honey hole of the bank. And what we're looking for, and the reason why it could be fishable, is because it has a greater current flow. So you always want to be watching the banks that you feel have a good current flow. Why is that the place to fish? Well, number one, it tends to clean out the silt along the bottom of the bank, so you have a little cleaner bank. It generally cuts a little deeper trough, so you have a little better trough in between the vegetation and the bank, and you also have cleaner vegetation because you get better water flow. And again, let's take a look over here. Hopefully you can see it, that current moving in through there. It's probably going to be hitting the bank right about down where that hyacinth and that Thule is. So if I was going to be fishing this bank and seeing all this current come in and hit the bank, the one place that I would fish would be that 100-yard section where you see that hyacinth up on the bank and that one little piece of Thule. I'd fish that for about maybe 5 or 10 minutes, run down that bank throwing chatterbaits, crankbaits, maybe some topwaters, maybe a few worms. If I got hit, then I would really work maybe 100 yards of that bank and maybe fish it out until I stopped getting bites. Okay, we're just down the bank here at Disappointment Slough. This is another place that you might want to start fishing, maybe the first part of your day. You see this inlet on this bank? The rest of the bank is just straight. This has this big crook in it. It not only has a big crook in it, but it has these Thules on it with some hyacinth, a few Thule breaks, but look what we have over here. What we were just talking about, having a cut in these Thules where it also adds current. The reason that that bank has that bend in it is because this is a part of the river that a lot of current hits that bank. So think about that, keep that in mind, and these little inlets like this, if you have 5 miles of bank and you've got one little place like this, give this a try, fish it fast, see if you can get anything going in places like this. Okay, I'm going to cut the chit chat and let you guys get out in the water and start fishing. So in closing, I wanted to just let you guys know that I haven't been real specific on the patterns that I've talked about. They're kind of broad, general things that you should be looking for, and that's how you go out and start fishing around for patterns. I think the big takeaways today are, before you go out, you always take into consideration seasonal patterns, daily weather patterns. You want to have an array of baits that are going to cover from top to bottom. They're also going to cover different speeds that they can be retrieved at. And you also want, if you're on the Delta here, you want to have baits that are going to be able to fish in and around heavy cover, maybe some punch baits or some frogging rods. The other thing that you should take out is when you start your day of fishing, look for banks that have multiple structures that will hold fish, whether it's tule, whether it's hyacinth, man-made structure, docks, shade, whatever it may be. You want to start your day fishing in those high priority places. You don't want to go to a brick-brack bank that runs a mile down the channel without a tule frond on it, or maybe some type of vegetation, surface vegetation, or whatever it may be. You want to start with as many things in your favor as you can and keep moving around, changing spots, looking for other spots that have multiple holding places for the fish. With that being said, if you guys are interested in specific things that I look for, let's just say when I'm coming up to a point and I'm fishing chatterbaits or worms, hit me up in the remarks. If I get enough of you guys that say, yeah, we want some individual things that we can talk about when we come up to a point or fishing, rock with certain baits or something like that, and we'll try to get a video out on that. But for now, hopefully that gives you guys some information. I'm glad you're watching. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, tell a friend, and other than that, just fish hard. Don't get discouraged. Don't let dock talk overrule you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys on the water.